why produce this paper on mass deportations, given that even Labour are saying we need deportations? Of course, Reform say we want to leave the ECHR, but even the Tories are now saying that. So given that all these parties have admitted it anyway, so what does this add?
It adds a sort of comprehensive detail that is lacking elsewhere. Political parties at the moment, I wouldn't treat Reform and Labour in exactly the same terms, but suffice it to say that in the case of Reform, you have a party that may be sort of saying directionally encouraging things about mass deportations, but hasn't provided the necessary detail at this stage. I mean, I don't know whether people are free to read. If they just type in Operation Restoring Justice online, they can find Reform's sort of 5 to 6 page report, which to our mind at Restore Britain isn't really up to scratch. Maybe they have something more comprehensive that they're working on behind the scenes, but as of yet, no sign of it. And in the case of Labour, the difficulty there is that they understand that the public mood on Britain's illegal immigration catastrophe is incandescent, is very, very annoyed indeed, and for good reason. We're a law-governed country, and with a tradition of taking our sovereignty seriously. And given that is our tradition, to be law-governed and to be sovereign, and to make a great deal of our sovereignty, particularly since the Reformation, there is inevitably going to be an annoyance when people... illegal immigration is reflective of the fact that those two things find themselves in very low water, namely our status as a law-governed country and our sovereignty. So people are very, very annoyed about this. So Labour realise that they need to make the right noises on the issue, but I would argue that they lack the real sort of political direction to do anything worthwhile on the matter. So we saw it as worth filling that gap in the market, as it were.
Yeah, that's reasonable. But yeah, and Reform with the 5 to 6 pages, it's got to be 113, guys, minimum.
At least, yes.
One of the things you say in the report is your aim is to deport 1.8 million people in 3 years, which is 150,000 so-called forced, and then voluntary exits, which is 3, you estimate 3 to every 1. And apparently in the US, they've managed a ratio of 4 to 1, so that seems plausible. But how do we get there from not being able to deport a single person? I mean, that's so... You've made it sound quite reasonable in the report, but given where we send 1 back and get 2 from France, it's a massive change.
Conservative Party and Reform, at least in terms of their public pronouncements, are now exceptions to this general rule, but there has been a failure to acknowledge the fact that we are at the level of law in our country. We're running on a sort of software, we're running on an operating system that is very much out of date. We're talking here about, in short, about the sort of the post-war human rights legal architecture. All sorts of international treaties and domestic legislation feed into this, from the UN Refugee Convention on Human Rights, our Domestic Human Rights Act, our membership of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is the text of which is interpreted by the court in Strasbourg, and that court, through something called the living instrument doctrine, has effectively expanded on the original meaning and text of the convention and extrapolated from that to produce outcomes that would have been way out of kilter with the intentions of the original drafters in 1950, 1951. So we find ourselves at this stage in history, having run on this operating system for the better part of a generation at this point, and there has been a kind of timid reluctance on the part of our mainstream political parties to challenge that sort of post-war framework, that post-war consensus, because there's been, if you speak to normies, they'll say things like, this kind of people who listen to, I don't know, The Rest is Politics with Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell.
Hang on, you're talking about my five-a-side football team here. That's I take offence. They actually do listen to that. I wasn't sure who, but it turns out it's for people in North London who I know.
Those sorts of people. And if you were to, I don't know whether you speak to them off the pitch, but were you to do so, you'd probably hear them say things like this. Oh, Nick, do you really want to join the ranks of Russia and Belarus in leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, in disapplying the UN Refugee Convention, all these sorts of things? There's this sort of overhyped fear of the kind of totalitarian backwater that Britain will instantly become if we were to leave the remit of these sorts of things. And so there has been a reluctance there on the part of our political class. And obviously this is changing because the situation has become untenable, which is why you now have the Conservatives saying that they would leave the European Convention on Human Rights. Of course, Reform have been there for for quite a while, but a significant chunk of our political class are so attached to this paradigm that they're incapable of self-correction on the matter. And so whatever they might say directionally in terms of policy, there remain too many legal obstacles in the way to effective delivery. And that's why part one of the report is called The Legal Obstacles to Mass Deportations, and part two, The Practical Logistics.
Yeah, it does actually remind me in other ways of the Brexit debate. So the kind of people that listen to Restless Politics are sort of the hardcore Remainers. And you actually had a figure in here that 52.7% of people would be more likely to support their MP if they backed mass deportations. I was like, well, I've heard that number before. So,
yes.
So this is the problem. There's a squeamishness amongst, despite that number, there's a squeamishness amongst people, about what this actually entails in reality. And of course, there's massive media resistance. How do you overcome that sort of politically? We'll get on to the legal detail, but how do you overcome that when we know that a 52% majority doesn't mean that things run smoothly?
That's right. And so let's assume that we have that we have an optimal legal framework in which there are no legal obstacles to our doing what we want to do, and we are left simply with pursuing the plan that is sort of laid out under the heading "Practical Logistics of Mass Deportations." I readily grant that there is, plans. Every single plan, even the best plan in the world. I'm not saying this is the best plan in the world, but even the best plan in the world assumes a whole set of variables applying elsewhere in the world. In order for it to be maximally effective, you need to have a civil service that is intent on delivering this sort of thing. You need to probably bat off domestic resistance. You probably need to defund many of the NGOs that are going to cause trouble to you. There are all sorts of other things, and these, alas, are not mentioned in the report because you can only say so much in a report. But I'd readily grant that there is likely to be domestic resistance. We've seen this in the United States. Trump sort of scuppering Trump's agenda a little bit. This is why we split our practical logistics section into two parts. This again, part two is practical logistics, but then there are two sort of subparts of that: voluntary returns and involuntary returns. The real advantage of not putting all of your eggs in the forced deportations basket is that you minimize the amount of resistance you're likely to encounter, because I readily grant that if you go into particularly into these sort of highly ghettoized neighborhoods with, men with riot shields, like beefed up immigration enforcement, looking like French gendarmes, and you go into these sort of neighborhoods, you're likely to encounter this sort of tribal resistance that you can see in the United States. Whereas if you were to do something much less dramatic and much more efficient than that, and ramp up what used to be called the hostile environment, it was technically called the compliant environment, but it came to be dubbed in the media as the hostile environment. Not a fake hostile environment where you sort of send vans around, people with megaphones saying go home, which is completely pointless, but actually really squeezing things. That means expanding right to rent checks, because to kind of crack down on rogue landlords. That means expanding right to work checks in order to crack down on rogue employers. Doing things like prohibitive taxes on remittances, using sort of exercising diplomatic pressure, not least through the Foreign Office, to try and bring third countries to heel and say, look, India, you make this much money per year from remittances. I remember the Nigerian figure better. 5% of Nigeria's economy comes from foreign remittances. Not all from Britain, admittedly, but that's a big chunk of their economy. If we, in Britain, were to say, look, we've noticed that your nationals have rather a habit of overstaying on their visas and living here as illegal immigrants after the expiry of otherwise legal visas, unless you voluntarily accept these people back and cooperate with us in trying to return them back, we are going to put a prohibitive tax on remittances. So it means using these slightly subtler methods, which are harder to resist because they're less visible. They're not quite as brazen as sending immigration enforcement into ghettoized neighborhoods. Although, of course, on occasion you will need to do that, because the forced deportations, in the same way that we don't put all of our eggs in the forced deportations basket, it would be foolish to put all of your eggs in the self deportations basket as well. These are sort of mutually reinforcing aspects of the same overall strategy to achieve mass deportations, and I think that they both need each other a great deal, and the one without the other is really no good at all. But together, they also drive each other up as well. So the more you expand the hostile environment, and the more you raise the probability of someone being forcibly deported, you're probably going to get that ratio from 4-1 to something like 5-1, because people are just going to think, I'd rather sort of leave on my own terms than be kind of collected by Rupert Lowe's based immigration enforcement crew.
Yeah. And of course in America they've even got an app which you mentioned. There's this portal. Of course, they've got all these videos as well. One controversial one with Theo Von, the comedian, where he didn't want to be in it, but they've got these cool videos and apps to say, "Hey, leave the country."
That's right.
So that's all part of it.
Stuff like that too, definitely.
Yeah, and if anyone's out there saying, "Well, we don't need this," or "You guys are just super right wing," I mean, there was a market analysis you mentioned from Thames Water, which concluded up to 1 in 13 people in London is an illegal immigrant, and that's based on estimates from 2017. So we can assume it's higher, and they now outnumber our armed forces, and yet we've only deported 6,313 since 2018, which is 4%. So it's incredible the scale of it. This is why it has this presumably this popularity of this 52.7% who would back their MP, which you don't necessarily hear if you listen to the media.
No.
But
so even in London, it's extremely high. It's like 46% of people in London say that they would support their MP.
Yes, the highest was the northeast.
It was the northeast,
but the northwest, where I'm from, was pretty high as well, like 64 or something.
I have also joked that it may be the case that the reason why London scores so high is because the Ethiopians assume the Eritreans are going to be deported, and the Eritreans assume that the Ethiopians are going to be deported.
Mutually assured deportations.
Mutually assured deportations. But as Josh Firm joked me the other day, well, that maybe there are some occasions when diversity does have its strengths.
I'm neutral. I'm just the interviewer, but interesting perspective.